Somewhere on the road to Jerusalem, a man pushed through the crowd and asked Jesus a question that most people are too polite to say out loud. "Lord, are only a few people going to be saved?" You can feel the nerves behind it. He is not asking for a definition. He is asking about the size of the group. Is the door big enough for everyone? Or is heaven a small room with a short guest list? And underneath that question is a fear that has followed people for 2,000 years. The fear that grace runs short, that salvation is a narrow opening and most of us are going to miss it. Jesus answers him, but his answer turns on a single word. A word that English has been mistranslating in our heads, if not on the page, for a very long time. The word is narrow. And here is the thing almost nobody realizes. When Jesus said narrow, he was not talking about how many people fit. He was talking about something else entirely. The original languages take the word we hear as exclusion and turn it into something closer to pressure, something closer to cost. The gate is not narrow because grace is in short supply. It is narrow because of what the road does to you on the way through. Once you see what that word actually carries, this teaching stops sounding like a rope held across a door to keep people out. And it starts sounding like the most honest thing anyone has ever said about following God. Let me set the scene, because this image shows up twice in two very different moments, and the settings matter. The first time is in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7. Picture a hillside above the Sea of Galilee, a crowd sitting on the grass, ordinary people, fishermen and farmers, and a few religious officials standing at the edges to size up this new teacher. Jesus has been teaching for 3 chapters straight, and he is almost done. He has talked about anger, lust, money, worry, judging other people, how to pray. He has spent the whole sermon raising the bar far past what the religious experts of his day taught. Righteousness, he keeps saying, is not about the performance everyone can see. It is about the heart no one can. And right near the end, before the final illustration about the 2 houses, he says this: enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Notice where that sits. It is not the opening pitch. It is the closing challenge. Everything he just taught about the cost of real righteousness, the turning of the cheek, the loving of enemies, the secret giving with no audience, all of it funnels down into this one fork in the road. 2 gates, 2 ways. Choose. The sermon does not end with a soft landing. It ends with a decision the listener cannot avoid making. Because not choosing is itself a choice for the wide road. You are on one of these 2 roads right now, Jesus implies, whether you meant to pick one or not. The second time is the scene we already walked into. Luke chapter 13. Jesus is traveling toward Jerusalem, toward the cross, and someone asks the head count question. And Jesus says, strive to enter through the narrow door, for many, I tell you, will seek to enter and will not be able. Same picture. Narrow entrance, a crowd, a warning. But watch what he does with the man's question. The man asked, how many? Jesus refused to answer the math. Instead, he turned it back into a command about the asker himself. Do not worry about the size of the crowd. Worry about whether you yourself are walking through. He took a question about statistics and made it a question about the listener. That move tells you something. Jesus is not interested in giving us a population estimate of heaven. He is interested in what kind of road we are on. So let us get into the word. In both passages, the word translated narrow is the Greek word stenos. And stenos does mean narrow. That part of the translation is fine. It is the kind of narrow you feel when a hallway tightens, when a canyon closes in, when there is no room on either side. Confined, constricted, pressed in. It is the word that gives us the medical term stenosis, the dangerous narrowing of a blood vessel or a valve, the kind of tightening that the body cannot afford. There is a moment in the Greek Old Testament that shows you exactly what this word does. In the book of Numbers, the prophet Balaam is riding his donkey down a path, and an angel of the Lord blocks the way. The text says the angel stood in a Stenos place, where there was no way to turn either to the right hand or to the left. Sit with that picture. A narrow place is not just a small place. It is a place with no room to drift. You cannot wander to the left. You cannot ease off to the right. The walls hold you to one line. That is Stenos. It is not about exclusion. It is about restriction. The narrow way is the way that will not let you sprawl. And notice that in the Balaam story, the narrow place is exactly where the man finally sees the angel he had been missing. The constriction is not punishment. It is the place where he is finally forced to pay attention because there is nowhere else to look. And here is where the Hebrew underneath makes it even richer. The Greek translators of the Old Testament use stenos to render a family of Hebrew words built on the root tsar. And tsar is doing two jobs at once that English keeps in separate rooms. It means narrow, tight, constricted, hemmed in. But the very same word also means distress, trouble, affliction, anguish. The root behind it, tsar, means to bind, to besiege, to press from all sides. Think about what that fuses together. In Hebrew, the word for a tight physical space and the word for emotional anguish are the same word. To be in a narrow place is to be in distress. To be squeezed by life is to be in a tsar. When David cries out in the Psalms that he is in trouble, look at the picture under the word. A man backed into a canyon, walls closing in, no room to turn left or right, and the enemy in front of him. The Hebrew imagination did not separate the feeling of being trapped from the geography of a tight place. They were the same experience, and so they became the same word. So before Jesus ever opened his mouth in Greek, the language he was steeped in already understood that narrow and hard were not two ideas. They were one. The narrow place is the hard place. The tight road is the troubled road. That is baked into the vocabulary, and the contrast Jesus draws makes the point even clearer. The wide gate gets its own word, and the broad road gets another. The road to destruction is called Eurykoros, which means roomy, spacious, with plenty of space to spread out. It is the opposite of pressed. There is room for everything on that road. Room for the cart, the cargo, the whole caravan, every version of yourself you never wanted to surrender. That is exactly the problem with it. A road with infinite room to drift is a road that asks nothing of you, corrects nothing in you, and leaves you to wander wherever the slope of your own desires happens to pull. The spacious road feels like freedom. It is actually just the absence of anything holding you to a direction. Which means when Jesus picks the word stenos, he is not describing a small entrance that only a few elite souls are skinny enough to slip through. He is describing a way of life that presses on you, that holds you to a line, that does not give you room to carry everything you wanted to bring. Look again at Matthew 7 verse 14. Narrow the road that leads to life. We have handled narrow, the gate word stenos. But the word describing the road is a different word entirely. In Greek, it is tethlimin. And it is not even an adjective. It is a verb wearing the clothes of a description. It is a participle, a past tense form of the verb phlibo. And phlibo means to press, to crush, to squeeze the way you would press grapes to get the juice out. It carries the sense of being compressed, hemmed in, afflicted. The same verb shows up elsewhere in the New Testament translated as trouble, afflict, and suffer tribulation. It is the root of the word the New Testament uses for the tribulations and pressures of the Christian life. When the Apostle Paul writes that believers are hard-pressed on every side, this is the family of words he reaches for. So the most literal rendering of that road is not the narrow road. It is closer to the road that has been squeezed, the pressed road, the road under compression. And here is a detail worth noticing. This is the only time in all four Gospels that Jesus uses this particular word. He reached for it once for this and never again. He had ordinary words for narrow available to him. He used a different one. He chose the word that means crushed. That changes the feel of the whole saying. The road to life is not narrow the way a turnstile is narrow, where the only problem is fitting through. It is narrow the way a mountain pass is narrow, where the walls press in and the going is hard. And you come out the other side having left some things behind. The difficulty is not a bug in the design. The difficulty is the description. Now go back to Luke, where Jesus is on the road to Jerusalem, and watch him pick yet another word for the same idea. In Luke, he does not say enter, he says strive to enter. And the word for strive is agonizomai. You can hear the English word hiding inside it. Agonize. Agonizomai was the word the Greeks used for an athlete in a contest, a wrestler straining against an opponent, a runner emptying himself for the finish line. It means to struggle, to fight, to strain every nerve. One scholar translates the phrase strain every nerve to enter. It is the same word Paul uses when he tells Timothy to fight the good fight of faith, and when he describes a fellow worker wrestling in prayer. This is not the vocabulary of a casual stroll. It is the vocabulary of someone giving everything they have. It is the same root as the noun agonia, the word Luke later uses for what happened to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he prayed in such anguish before the cross. I want to be careful here. The verse that describes his sweat falling like drops of blood is one that some of the oldest manuscripts do not include. So I will not lean the house on it, but the word connection itself is solid. The striving Jesus asks of us, and the struggle he himself endured, come from the same family of words. Contest, strain, struggle. The narrow door is not strolled through. It is pressed through. Quick word before we continue. If this kind of study in the original languages is helping you read your Bible with new eyes, consider becoming a channel member. That support is what keeps this work going week after week. To those of you who already are members, thank you. You are part of every script we write. Now, before we go further, we have to clear something off the table. Because well-meaning people have muddied this passage for years. You may have heard a sermon about this. It says the narrow gate was a small door cut into the big city gate of Jerusalem, a little opening called the eye of the needle. A camel could supposedly squeeze through it only on its knees, with all its baggage stripped off first. It is a lovely image. It preaches beautifully. It is also not real. There is no archaeological evidence for such a gate, no historical record of it. No ancient writer mentions it. The story appears to be a much later invention, repeated from one preacher to the next over centuries, because it makes a hard saying more comfortable. And it usually gets attached to a different verse anyway. That is the one where Jesus says it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. That saying was meant to sound impossible. That was the whole point. A camel is the largest animal in the region. The needle's eye is the smallest opening anyone could picture. And Jesus put them together on purpose to say, on your own, this cannot be done. The legend of a kneeling camel and a little gate quietly turns an impossible thing into a merely difficult one. It takes a saying about grace and turns it into a saying about effort. The narrow gate of Matthew 7 is not that gate either. Jesus is not describing a clever architectural feature in the Jerusalem wall. He is using a plain, universal image that any traveler in the ancient world understood instantly. 2 roads, 2 gates, one wide and easy, one tight and hard. I bring this up because the meaning of this passage does not need a fake gate to be powerful. The words themselves carry all the weight. We do not have to invent archaeology to make Jesus profound. The Greek already did the work. And it is worth a gentle warning to ourselves here, because this is how a lot of bad Bible teaching gets started. Somebody invents a colorful detail that makes a verse easier to swallow. It preaches well, people repeat it, and 300 years later it is treated as fact. The cure is simple. Stay with what the text actually says, in the language it actually used. The real thing is always stronger than the embellishment. And this is where it helps to know that Jesus was not introducing a brand new idea. He was stepping into a stream that ran back through the whole Hebrew Bible. There is an ancient pattern in Scripture sometimes called the 2 ways. The idea is simple and it is everywhere. Life is a fork in the road, and you are always standing at it. You hear it most clearly in the final speeches of Moses. Picture the scene. An entire nation camped on the plains of Moab at the very edge of the land they have wandered 40 years to reach. Moses is old. He knows he will not cross over with them. And in his last great address, he lays the whole future in front of them as a choice between 2 roads. I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both you and your descendants may live. 2 ways. One leads to life, one leads away from it, and the choosing is theirs. He even calls heaven and earth as witnesses to the decision, as if to say, this is the most serious thing I will ever put before you. You hear it again in the very first psalm, which opens the entire songbook of Israel by laying down the same fork. There is the way of the righteous, a person planted like a tree beside streams of water, roots deep, leaves green, fruit in season. And there is the way of the wicked, who are not a tree at all, but chaff the dry husk left over after the grain is threshed. So weightless the wind simply carries it off. One image has roots, the other cannot even stay in place. The psalm ends by saying the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked perishes. 2 ways, and they do not end in the same place. The Proverbs return to it constantly. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. The wisdom writers saw life as a daily navigation between 2 roads, one that looks appealing and ends badly, one that is harder and leads home. That little phrase, seems right, is the whole danger. The wide road does not announce itself as the road to ruin. It feels reasonable. It feels like what everyone is doing. That is exactly why it is wide. By the time of Jesus, this 2 ways teaching was woven deep into Jewish thought. It shows up in the writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls community. It shows up in the earliest Christian instruction manuals, which open with almost the same words Moses used, describing 2 ways, one of life and one of death. and a great difference between them. So when Jesus stands on the mountain and says, "Here are two gates. Here are two roads. Choose," his listeners would not have heard something foreign. They would have heard the oldest invitation in their scriptures, the one Moses gave on the edge of the promised land, the one the Psalms sang, the one their grandparents taught them. Choose life. That reframes the narrow gate completely. It was never meant as a threat designed to scare you about the odds. It is the same call God has been making since the edge of the promised land. Two ways are in front of you. One is wide and requires nothing and ends in ruin. One is tight and costs you something and leads to life. He is not slamming a door. He is begging you to take the right road. Read it that way, and the tone changes entirely. This is not the cold voice of someone guarding an entrance and turning people away. It is the voice of Moses with tears in his eyes telling a people he loves and is about to leave. Please, of the two roads in front of you, choose the one that leads to life. Jesus is standing in that same tradition, on that same errand. The narrowness was never about keeping people out. It was about pointing, as plainly as possible, to the road that actually goes somewhere good. So why is the good road the hard one? Why would the way to life be the one under pressure? Part of the answer is that the things worth becoming are not handed to you. They are formed in you, in formation presses. Nobody drifts into patience. Nobody accidentally becomes honest or gentle or faithful over decades to one person, or able to forgive someone who never apologized. Those things are pressed into a person the way a sword is pressed into shape with heat and force and repetition. The wide road produces nothing because it demands nothing. The narrow road produces something precisely because it costs something. The pressure is not the enemy of the life Jesus is offering. The pressure is how that life gets made. Here is something concrete to hold on to, drawn from the world Jesus and his listeners actually lived in. In the ancient Near East, a walled town did not leave its main gates flung open all night. The great gates, wide enough for carts and traders and animals loaded with goods, were shut and barred at dark for safety. A city with its main gate open after sundown was a city asking to be raided. But often, there was a second, smaller entrance built into or beside the great gate. A low, narrow opening that a single person could pass through on foot. A traveler arriving after the main gate was barred had one way in, and it was the small one. To get through it, he had to do certain things. He had to come on foot, not riding. He had to leave the loaded animal and the cart outside, or unload them and carry through only what he could fit. He could not bring the whole caravan and all the cargo through that small opening at once. He came through narrow, and he came through light. Whatever he had piled high on the back of that animal, the gate decided how much of it actually came in with him. That is the picture under the words. Not a trick gate, not a camel forced to its knees, just the ordinary truth that a narrow way will not admit everything you wanted to carry. The wide road lets you bring it all. Your baggage, your grudges, your divided loyalties, the version of yourself you are most comfortable with. The narrow road requires you to set things down. It presses you precisely because it will not let you keep everything. That is what makes it hard, and that is also what makes it good. The pressure of the narrow road is not God being difficult for the sake of it. It is the squeezing that leaves the extra weight on the ground where it belongs. And this is the point where the whole teaching opens up into something that stops being a warning and starts being good news. Because the question remains, if the road is that hard, that pressed, that costly, who could ever make it through? If salvation depends on my straining every nerve, on my agonizing my way down a crushed road, then the nervous man on the way to Jerusalem was right to be afraid. But Jesus does not leave the gate as a thing. He makes it a person. Later, in John's Gospel, he says it plainly, "I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved." And then, even more directly, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." There it is. The narrow gate is narrow because it is one, not because grace is in short supply, but because there is one door. And the door has a name, and the name is Jesus. He went through the real pressure of the garden, the cross, the full weight coming down. The narrow way of suffering that no one else could walk, he walked it to the end. And he opened the door from the other side, so that the gate we could never force our way through stands open because he is standing in it. Narrow does not mean grace runs short. It never did. In the language Jesus actually spoke, and the language he was actually quoted in, narrow means pressed. It means a way that holds you to one line and will not let you carry your whole old life through. It means a road with a real cost leading to a real life through a single, real door. Wide and easy has always been available. It asks nothing and it ends nowhere good. The other way is tight and it presses and it costs you the things you were never meant to keep. But it leads home. And the gate that looks too narrow to fit through turns out to be a person with his arms open, calling from every direction, "Come." There is room at the table. Come. Subscribe if this changed how you read the narrow gate. Leave a comment, even one word. Share this with someone who has been afraid the door was too small for them. Pray for us as we keep digging into these texts. And may the one who is himself the door walk every narrow place with you. God bless you.